Hey everyone, today we're going to cover the workflow for taking high poly sub-D models and optimizing them down to low poly models. I'll be using Maya for this demo, but the concepts and workflows discussed here can be applied to any 3D software. This video is part of a series on how to prepare real-time game-ready assets in a real production pipeline. This video is focused on understanding optimization workflows and things to keep in mind when you want to bake high poly detail down to your low poly models. As always, a like, subscribe, and share is always appreciated as I continue to grow the content of this channel. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so here we are in Maya, and you can see that I have the sub-D model version of the grenade, the smooth subdivided version of the grenade with 2 divisions, and the low poly model. And you can see that this is 61 tries, 1 million tries, and about 24,000 triangles. And what I've done is also recorded the process of me optimizing this grenade live. So I'm going to narrate and kind of discuss some of those high-level concepts towards the end of the video. And in the first part of the video, I'll just cover the overall key concepts for optimizing your models. So one of the most important concepts for optimizing your models is to maintain your silhouette and the silhouette of your model. Right? If I go up here to the editor here and say just use all lights, I don't have any lights in my scenes, you can see that it just turns everything black. All right. Now you can also use the surface shader to do this. Now what this allows us to do is focus 100% on the silhouette. So you can see here that, looking at the sub-D model and the 1 million triangle model, and then the optimized version, the silhouette is pretty much has been maintained throughout the entire optimization process. Okay, so this allows us to maintain the overall form and allow it to look like the original model. Because once we start optimizing, for example, if we take this now and I start to just remove the edges that are running along the main part of the mesh, this is where things start to become damaging, right? Now you can start to see this more noticeable hard corner here, and the silhouette has been negatively affected. Okay, now there's also a fine line between kind of pushing optimization even further. So you can see I can maybe take every other edge at this point and it still holds up pretty well, right? And context also matters, which brings me to the next concept, which is have a target triangle count in mind. You can see that here I started with 61,000 triangles, and this was meant to be subdivided, right? So if I go ahead, you can see that there's all sorts of good even flow of edge distribution on the model. I've covered modeling this grenade from scratch in some of my time lapses and previous videos, so make sure to check those out if you're interested in how I've created this. So you'll see how this is all set up. And then once it's subdivided, you can see that we have about 1 million tries here. Now, the key here is to take this subdivided detail and bake it down to the low poly model. Well, for the low poly model, we don't need to have all of those edges in here and holding lines and bevels, right? We can keep some bevels and remove them. Right. So knowing that I essentially want to take this to roughly about a quarter or maybe a third, a little bit over a third in optimization, right? So I'm at 24,000 triangles, and then this is 60,000, right? Now I created this for, as a hero asset, a hero grenade, right? So meaning that you're going to look at this grenade. If I turn on the resolution gate and gate mask, you can see that pretty much we're going to be looking at this grenade focused in on this much. There'll be a couple shots where I get in pretty close to about halfway where it'll take up a majority of the screen for sure. Now, if this grenade was just kind of a secondary prop or tertiary prop and I didn't need all of that detail and it's only ever going to take maybe 10% of the screen, that's where we can know, all right, well, my target poly count can be much, much less. I went in here saying I want to be around 25,000 triangles. If I get to 20,000 triangles, great. If I hit 30, I'll try to push that a little bit further. And that is all kept in mind as I want this to be a hero asset and a focused prop. Okay. Now, if this was, again, a lower poly prop, or something that's in the background, I can push it maybe down to 10,000 or even 5,000. It really depends on what the goal is. So know what your goal is before going through and beginning your optimization process. The next key concept is to, of course, leverage the base mesh where possible. All right. Now, in some instances, if you saw one of my previous videos, I showed how to take a high detailed sculpt, and I showed retopologizing concepts for that. In this instance, we have a sub-D model that is ready to be subdivided, and then we want to convert that into a real-time 3D model. All right. So because I have this here, for example, if I go ahead and just duplicate and unparent this with Shift P and hit isolate, you can see now I can go in and start removing some of those holding lines and bevels that don't need to be here, right? I mean, that was a big part of what I did on this model, right? I would say probably a good example was when I started to go through, some of these assets here, and I would say this is kind of the simplest example here. You can see if I hit 3, go into smooth preview, you can see that it subdivides very nicely. But for the low poly model, I don't need all of those holding lines since I'm going to bake it down. Well, that's where I can simply go in here and start removing those bevels and all of these lines here to leverage this model and save me a lot of time. All right, so this kind of saves you time as you're modeling the original mesh and then when you're creating the base mesh. So definitely leverage where you can. And of course, you can start to even take it further and removing essentially all of these other lines that aren't really adding to the silhouette. Remember, if this is the key silhouette here, then these lines on the inside here don't need to be there, right? But clearly I need these lines and these edges here because that's where that matters. I wouldn't want to go ahead and remove this edge here, because this is a key line that is helping define the original form and silhouette. And this would cause baking issues if I just outright deleted that, right? And then you can see if I turn on the lights again and take a look at the original mesh, you can see what kind of problems that would cause. As you can see here, here's the optimized version, and then this is the high poly version. And you can see that if I were to take the low poly version now, and remove this key edge here that's defining this silhouette, that's going to cause a lot of issues, and it's going to cause baking issues, right? You'll see that here if I go ahead and assign a different material to this, something like this, where we have kind of the green here on the low poly, and then you can see kind of the difference that's causing. So this is a technique that I use all the time, is making sure that I have different and contrasting materials for the low poly and the high poly materials here. All right, so keep that in mind as you're going through and optimizing, is to leverage the base mesh where possible. All right, so the next concept I wanted to bring up is, especially when doing optimization, is triangles are completely fine. So when I'm doing sub-D modeling even, having an occasional triangle is completely fine, right? And there was a couple of joke comments about how it was like blasphemous and I can't believe that, or I spent a big part of my career making sure that I never had triangles. So did I, you guys. It's not a big deal, right? So just keep that in mind because the algorithms for essentially subdividing these triangles into quads is not an issue. As much of an issue, right? You have to be careful. Don't go crazy with triangles, but having an occasional one is completely fine. So if I go ahead and subdivide that, look what it did to that triangle, right? It went ahead and actually turned this into a quad, which is okay, right? And I made sure that it's not artifacting either, right? So you can see if I look around here, there is no visible artifacting here. So why worry about changing that when I don't need to? Now, if we take a look at using triangles for optimization, you'll see that this model is full of triangles all over the place. And this is just going to help with the optimization process because I don't want to carry over edges that I simply don't need, right? And that's a big part of the optimization process, all right? So make sure to use them where you need them. Like if I go ahead here, you'll see that I just use them all over the place here to not run all of those triangles and edges throughout the the rest of the model that I just don't need them. And I'm eliminating edges that are running horizontally, the ones that are running vertically in different axes. So it's just becoming very, very optimized, right? So again, if you take a look at what I had previously, not this one, the sub-D model here, you'll see that if I take this, duplicate it, and we'll just go ahead and move this a little bit closer, you can see just how much more optimized this is versus the original base mesh. Now, because this is such a key part of the silhouette, I didn't remove a lot of the edges running down the grenade, but I certainly can. And you can also see in areas like this right here, that's where I cleaned up and removed a lot of the edges here and just kept them as triangles. Okay, so triangles are completely fine, are great for terminating edges that you don't need to run throughout the duration of the model, and it just keeps things very clean. And you can see here how I removed the holding lines and edges that I kind of talked about at the beginning, where that's no longer needed for the low poly model. All right. So then the next thing is making sure that you add in geometry for your corners. Okay. So what do I mean by that is if you take a look here, in a lot of areas that are going to have kind of this softer radius, if you just have this be very sharp. So if I take this now and actually compare this with the sub-D model here, and I'll go ahead and bring this over to this. This should be about 0. There we go. Now, if I go ahead and compare this now, this next tip again is about making sure to add geometry for your corners. So again, I'll go ahead, I'll apply a different shader, and let's take a look at the difference here, right? So we have this model, and then if we take the original base mesh here and I move that, you'll take a look at kind of the difference that's happening here. And I'll go ahead and kind of isolate all of these. All right. So we have this part of the grenade here. This is the optimized version. And then this is the original sub-D model. All right. So let me compare the original sub-D model with the actual subdivided version of the grenade. And then I'll change this to even a different color. I'll change this to red so it's much more visible. And look at that. Right? This is going to subdivide fine, and I got my holding lines to make sure that this subdivides nice and clean and nice and evenly, and it looks great. But you can't simply just take that model and then try to bake this detail here into this corner. It's just not going to work. I covered that in the last video on tips for baking high to low, and you're just going to need to make sure to add in some of that geometry. Well, that's why I did that right over here. If I take the green one now and compare it with the sub-D model, now look at the difference, right? Take a look at now how I went in and cut in some extra edges that I needed just specifically in this area, and it's going to just bake into that detail significantly better, okay? So make sure to keep that in mind. This was probably the best example for corners. In some instances too, it's okay to have, these kind of corners here that are completely flat. But if you have corners like these that have like this nice round radius, having a very sharp corner, I'm going to just quickly delete this and then I'll undo it. If I remove that, trying to bake this round corner into this is going to produce a lot of artifacts. So that's why I want to make sure to have a good radius for our corners. Now, again, this depends on how low and what's your target poly count. If your model can't afford it and you have to go extremely low, then you're just going to stick with this as your corner edge here and then baking that down. You can still get by with doing that. So just keep that in mind that on occasion, these are just general guideline rules, and don't think that this is, the end all be all for as far as optimization, but these are just general guidelines to help. Okay. Now, the next tip, which is really important, is making sure to use what's called a shrink wrap, which is really nice, because there's something to keep in mind when working with sub-D models is that a lot of times your models will lose volume when they're being subdivided. So if I take this now, and this is the sub-D model, so I'll just kind of hide that or get rid of that. And then here's the low poly model that I duplicated. And then you can see that if I wanted to take this and then smooth this or shrink wrap this on this surface, you certainly can, right? So for example, if I take, you can do this on face selection. So for example, if I go ahead and select kind of these faces here, and I'll go ahead and just do a shift period and go ahead and kind of grow that selection there, and then we get something like this, okay? I don't want to do the insides because it's a separate piece, but this is good because now I can take these surfaces, okay, and then I can take the high poly version. So now if I take this high poly version, I'm going to have to manually select it here. So you'll see it's poly surface 92. So if I go back, I have this, and then I grab poly surface 92. This is where you can use the deform and use shrink wrap. Okay, so if I grab this, and these are typically the settings that I use for shrink wrapping, and what this is going to do is help make sure that it wraps on this mesh here. So I typically use projection and these settings, and then hit apply and take a look at that. Now it's gone ahead and wrapped itself around the mesh, and this is going to be very, very helpful. There are a couple of areas that I do plan to go back and kind of cut in some detail to help with these corners here, especially being kind of on this high visible part here. So I do plan to fix that, but at least you get the idea of how to use shrink wrap, right? And if I take this piece here, again, I can show you kind of as a quick example. I think this was a good piece that I ended up using here. So I'll duplicate this one and just show you quickly on an entire mesh point of view. And I'll grab the two here, and I'll assign the material here for the low poly. So we have that with the low poly version. And now what I can do is select the high poly, select the low poly, and if I can get that real quick, so I'll just select it from my outliner here. There we go. So you want to select, or excuse me, it's the other way around. Low poly, then your target mesh. Okay, so again, select your low poly, then your target mesh that you want to shrink wrap on, and then you can use deform, shrink wrap, and then hit apply, and then that goes ahead and does it. So I've already done that in this instance, so I'll show you like a quick example of it kind of working. So I'm just going to move these, hold control middle mouse, and just kind of move these out a little bit so it's a little bit larger, and you can see by smooth previewing and mesh smoothing, it does lose some volume. So I can take this mesh, this low poly version, take the high poly, and then now you can kind of see it, especially right here on this part of the radius, and hit apply. Boom, look at that. So now this low poly is pretty much 1-to-1, and it's I don't have to worry about it, you know, create any custom cages or anything. It just fits the mesh. Okay, and custom cages, I mean for baking that detail and that projection. All right, so shrink wrap is an incredibly useful technique I use all the time, and I use it all over the mesh, so definitely keep that in mind. So along with using the base mesh and optimizing the base mesh with a combination of using shrink wrap, I'll use another technique where sometimes if I just want to just completely rework the topology, I will just use Quadra. Quadra is just a fantastic tool for that. Actually, this is what I did specifically in this area here. So if I go ahead and kind of delete this, and for example, I'll just stick with this, and I'll select the high poly mesh and set it to live, select my low poly mesh here, and then go to the tool modeling toolkit and then enable Quadra, and then now I can just start working off of this original mesh and start working off of the high poly model, and eventually just start to just rebuild and have complete control over the topology here. So it's just a very nice quick way to do that. Leveraging the high poly mesh, you know, I've covered how to use the Quadra tool set in one of my last videos with the dragon head, so make sure to check that out. But yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a real quick high level workflow, and then I cover that in the time lapse as well. All right. And the last thing I want to make sure to cover is make sure to review examples. I mean, I bring this up all the time in my videos, and just study professional artists and people, instructors posting. So here, I mean, this one popped up the other day, or at least on my feed, by Yuji Moon, and he just has this fantastic model. I was like, wow, this is just amazing. And then I looked at the low poly cage. I was like, wow, look at all of that detail that's being projected down on the low poly. And he says here, this hero model, this entire hero model is 30,000 polygons. All right. And the key thing, he applied all of the principles I'm talking about here in this video, which is, if you take a look at this model, he has made sure that the most important thing is maintained, which is the silhouette of this model. All right. The silhouette of the model is maintained, and he's, making sure that he knew the triangle count going in, and he's using triangles all over the mesh, which is, again, completely fine. And then he's making sure to have more edges in those smooth corners so it bakes properly, and, probably using shrink wrap where applicable. So, I mean, it's just, again, a really, really great example, and just showing how you can do that throughout the mesh. Here's another example I found. By Stanislav Teslenko, and I really liked his model here because he really high detail, nice details. But if you look at the base mesh, the low poly, I mean, he's incredibly optimized here. He also didn't have to use any bevels or holding lines or anything like that. Everything's just baked nice and clean, so it really depends on your target triangle count. And you can see his, just for this prop here, it's again 30,000 triangles. All right, now keep in mind, sometimes if people use the word polygons, that you basically want to double it for triangles. So this looks like 60,000 triangles, and this is going to be about 30,000 triangles for this piece. And here's another one for a character. Again, the most important thing here is the silhouette of the character, right? And this is by David Bolton, and you can see, just very, very nicely clean, optimized, could even flow, distribution, all of that good stuff. And then again, focusing on the silhouette. And then I like this one by Carol Sung, where you can kind of see, she's making sure that she's having all of that, most of that detail in the most curved, the places that need it the most, which is anywhere that has curvature. And then you can see around kind of the base of the gun here. And then she baked it from this Fusion 360 model. And you can just kind of see, with a combination of using curvature where you need it and having triangles, everything kind of comes together really, really well. So definitely look at some good examples there. And then keep in mind, in some areas, I'll have kind of this beveled edge here. Okay. So I'll keep kind of this supporting edge to help with baking, or sometimes I just won't need it. Okay, and there's a little bit of cleanup I have to do on the edges and stuff like that, but I at least wanted to show you this part now. And, I could maybe put a holding line. I did do it on a couple of more obvious areas, so I did add some holding lines here. But again, if I needed to push the optimization even further, I would just delete these edges and focus on using that. All right, but I wanted to keep kind of a mid-range higher poly count for this, and about 24,000 triangles. I felt like that was accomplished. So you can see that's faces typically is going to be, or faces are polygons here. Okay, so these are the key concepts that I used to create this model. So next, what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you the time lapse, and I'll just kind of explain that process and a little bit of a narration on the overall workflow and where I'm applying these principles. All right, so I'll see you guys there. All right, so here I am starting the optimization process, and the first thing I did was duplicate it. I always recommend duplicating your meshes, applying a different material, so that way your files don't get corrupted, and you'll be good to go. I then went ahead, since the insets were separate pieces, I went ahead and removed any extrusions from there, and then I'll eventually combine that back to the original mesh. Now I'm going through the process of removing all of the holding lines, the extra subdivision lines for the even distribution for the sub-demodeling, and I'm just outright just deleting them and removing them since it's not needed for the low poly. In some instances, I go back and add in some edges there just to kind of help maintain the original form. And then here it's just a little bit of a tedious process going through over and over again for each one of these insets and cleaning up that topology. So I basically go through the whole process on one or two of them, and then I go ahead and just kind of show the final product. Here I'm going back now and adding in some geometry to help with the curvature and cleaning up some of the bottom edges there. And then now you can see I went ahead and combined it on the sub-D model. Now comes the important task of making sure that I'm matching the curvature. Having essentially just maybe 2 to 3 edges for that top curvature isn't helpful, so I have to make sure that I cut in some more to be able to get the most out of my bakes. So I went ahead and did this on a couple of these pieces here, and I'm evenly spacing them out. That's why I also have wireframe on edges showing, or edge faces showing, so I can see and get a more or a better looking distribution of edges here. So I think I kept it around 2 to 3 edge span, and then I went ahead and cleaned up kind of the bottom here. Yep, I'm definitely using a lot of triangles here, making sure that I keep things optimized and doing whatever I need to do. I'm now working on the top piece here, and this is where you want to make sure that you add that edge basically on the highest point of the corner to help with baking, and then I go ahead and give this area a bevel here, and then I'm just continuing on around the loop. And this is where I do quite a bit of optimization, so you can see how I'm just merging, combining, deleting edges all throughout this top piece, which helped remove just a lot of detail that just wasn't needed since it was completely flat. I go ahead and continue this through the front part of the grenade. And now I'm working on this corner radius piece that I was talking about. So I'm going in, cutting in some of the edges and making sure that I have the geometry to support for when I'm going to bake that detail in. So this is very, very important that I covered in the earlier part of the video, and you can see me putting it into practice here. And then I go ahead and kind of show how I do that on the corner radius as well on the front part of the grenade. Just going in and cutting. I actually ended up, instead of cutting the bottom piece, I just moved the other edge up since it helped maintain the original silhouette. Now, this is the part where I switch to another piece, and you can see that I'm beginning by just taking and removing all of the holding lines and edges. And I do a little bit of cleanup, and this is where I deleted that inner piece, that inner inset, and then I ended up just using quad draw there. So I'll go ahead and let that go through, and then I kind of keep those corner pieces because it is a pretty wide round radius or wide radius for the corner, so I kept that there. And then here you can see I'm using, switching between multi-cut, quad draw, and just making sure everything's aligned up and cleaned up. And then I'm just using the wireframe as well on the sub-D model to make sure that I keep good even spans and distances between the edges, so that'll ultimately help with the getting nicer clean bakes by the end of it. And just some more cleanup here. I decided that I wanted to keep the few edges there for that piece since it was such a focal point and kind of an obvious piece on the top portion of the grenade. And just a little bit of cleanup here. This is also why it's important to have good clean edge flow, because it just makes your life easier down the road, especially when you need to create an optimized version, level of detail models, or if you're unwrapping, even wanting to take it to sculpt. Edge flow is just incredibly important for that. And then just a little bit more cleanup. And then you'll see me use, once I'm done here, just finishing up the bottom piece. Yeah, pretty shortly here. Yep, I went ahead and shrink wrapped it. So make sure to use that. And then once I shrink wrapped it, I just kind of finished it off and cleaned it up. And then I went ahead and I'll be jumping to the next part and the next piece. So there's about a few minutes left here, and it's just doing the same thing over and over again. So I think you guys get it. I'm going to let the time lapse go, and I just wanted to make sure to thank you guys for watching. Hopefully you found this helpful. The next part of the video, I'll be sure to cover the final cleanup stages of the model and then getting it ready and applying UVs. All right, so that was the main part of this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys around. All right, if you stuck around for the end, I really appreciate it. Hopefully you found this helpful. And if you got any suggestions, let me know on anything that you want me to cover in a future video. But again, I'll be covering unwrapping and preparing the model for the final bake in the next video. So I'll see you guys there. Thanks a lot.